Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
Exceptionally well. I'm so glad to be here. We are at episode 190. Oh, there's so many episodes, 190. I can't believe we've been doing this so long, Rory, of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We are so glad that you have joined us here today. We have got 3 super duper topics that we hope that you're going to get some value off. Starting off with our student check-in, where we kind of try and relate something that a student may come across on their student journey. But today's topic, one of great interest to me, and I think will be a great interest to students and qualified practitioners as well, and that is Erik Erikson's human developmental stages. We're going to dig into that, and I've got a little bit of a story to tell you relating to that as well. Then we go into our digital counselling revolution, where we recognize technology forms part of how therapy is consumed and delivered by us as therapists. And we're going to be speaking about establishing identity of the client. This has been a recent debate. It's a good topic. It's of great interest. You're going to love this one. And then we end with practice matters. And in practice matters, we're going to be taking a peek into practice. This is where we take a practitioner, have a look at what they do in their practice. They share that with us. And Rory is going to be speaking to Mia Elkin, who's going to be speaking about the differences between practice as a counsellor or psychotherapist in the United States of America and the United Kingdom. So that's our episode 190 for you. Starting off with that student check-in, Erik Erikson, human developmental stages, Rory.
Yes, I think Erik Erikson is a not very well known theorist in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. I don't often hear his name mentioned, and he did coin the term identity crisis. So I think he's an interesting person because he talks about psychosocial development. In other words, where people find themselves in the arc of their lives, and how where they are kind of chronologically in terms of their age, what challenges and what kind of issues may be relevant for them. And he developed a model called lifespan development, and it's a very, very comprehensive model that tracks how people may view the world from literally birth to death. And it goes through the arc of it. And it's a really interesting model in terms of it can frame where a client is. Sometimes clients come and they say, do you know, I don't know why I'm feeling like I am. And sometimes just having the awareness of where they may be in this model can be quite an interesting insight for the therapist in terms of where the direction they go and the interventions they use. I'm a very different person at nearly 63 years old than I was at 20. And, you know, and I know that if I look back at my 20-year-old self, I was very, very different in terms of how I feel about my life. And that, of course, affects everything that goes on around me. So it's a very phenomenological position. And I think it's one that's worth looking up. I see it being taught a little bit more now on courses. People ask for resources and contact me a little bit more about it. But I think that Erik Erikson had a very wise view of human development, Ken.
Yeah, so looking at Erik Erikson, so we're speaking about, the official name for this is the stages of psychosocial development. So psycho, what is happening within the psyche, social, how the psyche is being acted on by our social interactions at various stages within our lives. And so if you take Erikson, he was an ego psychologist, so based on the work of Sigmund Freud. And of course, Sigmund Freud was very much into the psychosexual development side of things, whereas Erik Erikson, he went more down the psychosocial developmental route. And he put together 8 stages that kind of map the stages that a person goes through from birth and at various stages in their lives, and kind of, I guess, what we might be writing as our rules for engagement in our psyche based on how we interact with our social environment at various stages within our lives. So I did say in the intro that I would share a little bit of a story. So you mentioned, Rory, going into this, that maybe you haven't come across Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. I know you trained counselors for many, many years, and I don't think it was part of the curriculum. But I can share with you that in South Africa, this is a very much part of the curriculum. So I think maybe here in the UK, maybe not as widely taught, but I came across this before I came into counselling. In fact, it was one of the bits of theory that I came across that led me to become a counsellor, because I found it so interesting. And it was during the time that I was doing some work as a clown doctor. So if you know the name Patch Adams would go into hospitals, and he believed that laughter was the greatest medicine, and he would go to relieve people's pain just by bringing them a few moments of entertainment and laughter. And there's a very famous movie by the late Robin Williams on that topic there. But I was training under an organization called the Theodora Foundation, and part of my training was some psychological training at Witwatersrand University in South Africa, where we went through Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, and I got hooked on it. I found it so incredibly interesting, and it made sense to me. So it's kind of part of the stepping stone that led me to become a therapist. And we'll start off with stage one. And the stage one is called trust versus mistrust. And when we're looking at this stage one, and it's the 8 stages, this is the very, very first one, we're talking about that infant, that baby that doesn't have verbal communication, that is 100% dependent on the intervention of the primary caregivers. When the baby cries, there needs to be a trust within that baby that somebody is going to come to them to tend to their needs, because the baby is not able to tend to their needs themselves. So at this stage, if the baby has an experience where their needs are not met, then they can develop a level of distrust at this very early stage. I have a need. I can only work on trust because I can't fend for myself, but my needs are not being met, therefore I cannot trust. I cannot even trust my primary caregivers. And the opposite side of that is that the baby's needs are met, and then trust is developed, and then this individual in the model, in Erik Erikson's model, would then go on and in adult life be more trusting. So where might we see trust versus mistrust appearing within our therapy room? It may be a client that doesn't trust anybody, can't trust anyone. If you want a job done well, you've got to do it yourself. You may be able to kind of delve into the 8 stages there and visit that trust versus mistrust. So it's kind of written, that rule is written psychologically. We're not aware of it. It's down in the subconscious, but it is pulled upon as the person goes through life. Which brings us neatly, Rory, onto stage 2, which is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So by now the child is a little older. So they now are taking maybe those first steps, and it's during the time of toilet training and what the child takes away from that. So during toilet training, it is inevitable that the child is going to have accidents. It's just part of the process. But how are those accidents dealt with by the primary caregiver? Is shame imparted into that child? Because the child is trying to learn the autonomy over the control of their own body. And you only need to look to a toddler who's going through this stage to see how they struggle when they walk, yes, and they stagger and they fall. But that autonomy over their own body and their own bodily functions, being able to hold something in versus them having no control and that just happening to them. But how that is interacted with from primary caregivers and what feeling comes up for that child. So for example, a negative experience for a child might be that the child has an accident, the child wheezes in their pants, and then they are ridiculed or they are kind of chastised for making that mistake, which is great foundations for building shame for that child. And again, this becomes psychological or hidden to the person. And as they go on in their life, they may be more prone to feelings of shame. Whereas the flip side of that coin, where it may be, that's okay, that happens to everyone, this is all part of the process, you're okay, we're going to go through this together. There's nothing to be ashamed about. And the child is getting a very nurturing, very caring, very loving message, which could lead in later life to the person feeling that they can take more chances, that they're okay with themselves, that they're okay to go out and make those mistakes. They don't have to feel element of shame around that.
Yes, absolutely, Ken. And again, this comes up so often, I think, in client work, where a client may give you a indication of how they were treated in early childhood.
Yeah.
And you can see this theory really played out. I've worked with so many adults who have had real difficulties at this age with their caregivers, and it does echo through the years. It becomes still a presenting issue. It is what we call the presenting past.
Yep.
And I think as we move on through Erikson's stages, we come to stage 3, which is initiative versus guilt. Now, at this point, the child is usually around 3 to 5 years of age, so they're probably going to preschool. And the major questions that face a preschool child is, how can I be competent at things? We've seen children in classes, those of us who've seen our children in classes, wanting to be really good. I want to learn to write and do math and run around and basically be good at things. And I think that if a caregiver or indeed a teacher, I think both Ken and myself will have stories about this, crushes a child emotionally, that can have a real big impact. And the impact is that people may feel inferior. And I'll share a story from my life. It's well known that I'm dyslexic, and that when I went to school a lot of years ago, of course, dyslexia wasn't a word that probably even existed, I don't think. So the pedagogical technique of trying to get children to read and write was to hit them, and or ridicule them. And I can tell you that that was a technique used by my teachers for most of my school life, and I really struggled with feeling competent in the world at anything because of those early messages. And I didn't feel competent, Ken. And I think, again, we see that so often played out in client work.
Definitely. I mean, I think having an understanding of these stages of development is interesting because you can link it into your counselling theory no matter what theory you practice. And you're speaking there about that initiative versus guilt. It's the stage in the child's development where they now have control over their own body functions. And they're now trying to see, what control can I exercise over my external environment? Other people, objects within a group setting. What do I have influence over? And it's those early stages of the child exercising that control of others. And you'll see this play out in a preschool when it comes to sharing. You'll see a child going, no, I'm going to eat all these sweets. I'm not going to give them to you. And that's the child exercising their power. I want that toy. You're not going to get that toy. And that's a very powerful expression of that third stage, I guess. And the outcomes on that is that the children exercising that control, that power over their own environment, and the success in this stage can lead to a sense of purpose, that I am successful, I can create change in my external environment. And of course, the flip side of that, the more viewed as more negative side of that, is maybe a child who tries to exert that expression too powerfully is maybe going to experience disapproval, maybe from the teacher or the caregiver, or even from the other person that they're trying to exercise that control on. The message is, what do they take away from that? What subconsciously is written? A little piece of computer code is written from those interactions, which is then replayed again and again and again and again right throughout the arc of this person's life. So there you have it. That's stage 3, initiative versus guilt. And it brings us on to stage 4, which is industry versus inferiority. The 4th psychosocial stage takes place during the early school years, from about the ages 5 to 11, and the social interactions children begin to develop a sense of pride in their own accomplishments and abilities. It's this age that you're going to start getting the artwork home that goes on the fridge, and the pottery, the pottery mug and the pottery vase. It's where the child is starting to go, I'm good at this. I'm a good runner. I like colouring in. It's where that child is starting to interact with their world in that kind of way. And the outcomes, those who are encouraged and they get kind of positive reinforcement by maybe their primary caregivers or their teachers, they're going to develop a feeling of competence, and they're going to believe in themselves more as they go out into life. And of course, those that receive the opposite of that, the negative side, where they're not receiving that encouragement, when they're not receiving that praise, the kind of feeling for that child is, I put myself into this, I think it's great, I put it forward, and it is rejected, or it is not good enough, and they can take that into life. And how often do we see presenting in our counselling rooms somebody who doesn't believe that they're good enough, Rory?
Oh, absolutely, and too many times. And in my experience as a practitioner, you only have to listen for long enough to hear, again, and we'll bring some Rogerian theory, introjected values, where children have been told they're not good enough. And I cannot overemphasize how much early childhood messages can really resonate through the arc of someone's life painfully, very, very, very painfully.
Yeah.
And then we move on to stage 5, which is identity versus role confusion. And I think this speaks very, very much to young people just going into the world, trying to find out who they are in the world. And it can also speak, I think, to sexuality. I think that at this age, this idea of who am I, what do I do, where do I fit in the world, can be very, very, very connected to people developing a basic or a sense maybe of their sexuality. And again, this stage is so crucial, because if it isn't handled correctly, children can feel not very independent. They can feel that they haven't got a voice in the world. And they really do need to successfully develop the virtue of their identity. And if they haven't formed their identity, that can be an issue that comes up in later life in therapy, Cam.
It is. This, I think, is a really interesting stage. We're talking about the ages of 11, 12 years old to the teen years, maybe 18 years old. And we're talking about identity versus role confusion, where the young person is now saying, who am I? How do I fit into this world? How do I fit into the groups of others? What football team do I cheer for or support, or what football team don't I cheer or support? And when we're speaking about football teams, I remember I was born in the UK, but we went over to South Africa when I was quite young. But in our home before we went over to South Africa, we used to support a certain football team which was local to us. When I got over to South Africa, they were supporting different football teams, Rory. Football teams I'd never even heard of before.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And I kind of didn't fit in. I was an outcast. It was not accepted. The football team. I couldn't say who I supported because it wasn't understood. It would almost be criticised by my peers. And here, when we're getting to identity versus role confusion, we're getting to see how peers and those others that we interact with can have a profound impact on someone's life. And I think of somebody, and I'm just using this as an example, somebody who knows that they are gay. But do I dare speak this out? Will this be accepted by others, or will I be ridiculed? Am I able to embrace my identity and say, this is who I am proud to be this way? Or am I confused about my identity? Am I going to keep part of me hidden away, a part that I don't dare show to others because when I was younger and I did show those parts to others, they ridiculed me? So there's the negative side. The positive side, of course, is that acceptance from others, others going, yes, I want to be like you. I also want to be a goth. I also listen to that music. I also choose that football team. And you start finding your place in the world, where you fit in. And of course, where we might see this in therapy once again is in terms of incongruence, when a person doesn't feel that they can be who they truly, really are. And of course, on a more positive side, it may lead to confidence and a pride in being who the person is.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And it also speaks to that crucial stage where children are making multiple attachments, and it speaks to how people develop their attachment style as well. Because as we know, children have a primary attachment to their caregiver, but as they get older and they develop an identity, they develop sometimes a group identity. Ken's mentioned goths or supporting football teams, and that is all part of attachment, attaching to a group of like-minded people and feeling part of a collective where people think the same and act the same. And children go through this. Sometimes they want to be a goth, they want to be a footballer, I want to be a racing driver. But it's all part of finding out their identity. Who am I? Who will I become?
Yeah. And it can key into your faith. It just keys into so much. So there you have it. You then move on to intimacy versus isolation. And this is the start of those more intimate relationships with partners, and about, are you embraced? Is that a positive experience from you? Are you okay within intimacy, or does that tend to break down for you and you find yourself in a place of isolation? And of course, what is really interesting as we look at these 8 stages, Erik Erikson's developmental stages, they build on one another. And we've already spoken about the fact that these act out subconsciously once that thought or that bit of software, call it, has been written to the subconscious. It's acting out. And you can find someone coming to that young adulthood stage where they're in those first steps of finding relationships, very much being influenced by the stages that came before that. So if the person, going right back to that trust versus mistrust, which is the first stage, if the infant at that stage developed mistrust, and then if we kind of go on a little bit to maybe the initiative versus guilt, maybe the person has mistrust from something that happened as a baby. Maybe when they went to preschool, when they tried to interact with peers, that was not accepted as they'd hoped, and they carry negativity from that. It's likely they're going to take that, and that's going to be part of who they are when they present in those relationships. So it's interesting how they build on one another. So there it is. It's intimacy versus isolation. How does that person do when interacting in a more intimate and more sexual manner with the person of their choice? What is their experience of that? They take away something positive and go out into the world saying, I am lovable, I am okay. Do they take away a negative reaction from that? I am unlovable, everybody is going to leave me.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And we see this presented so often in the therapy room. And the basic virtue of that stage is love. Can I be loved? Am I worthy of love? And this is something, in my experience in practice, has come up so often, where people feel that they're just can I really be loved? Can people love me? And you're absolutely right, Ken. If you go through those other stages, you find they compound as they go through. So if any of those stages are not correctly addressed and correctly traveled through, they carry on into the next stage and onto the next stage.
Just before we move on to the next one, Rory, as you're kind of saying that, it reminds me, so you have a presentation maybe in the therapy room where someone says, oh, I just have bad relationship after bad relationship after bad relationship. They're always breaking down. I can never hold on a relationship for very long. Areas of inquiry there, if it matches your modality of counselling, is to maybe go back and say, tell me about your very first relationships, because this developmental stage suggests that it could have a seed in those early relationships. And of course, we're talking now from ages 19 up to about 40 years old, at which stage the person goes into that kind of middle adulthood and the next stage, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're hurtling into what is sometimes unkindly referred to as middle age. And at this time, the theory is generativity versus stagnation. And this really speaks to, how can I contribute to the world? How can I be part and stamp myself on the world and be part of it? And I think this is, again, an interesting stage because at that time, adults are nurturing, creating things. They usually have families of their own. So they're learning to care for others. They're probably very, very busy in their jobs, developing their careers. And maybe they're doing, maybe they're doing work, charitable work as well. Maybe they're doing some charity work, some volunteering. And this party kind of concretes in their identity of how they are in the wider world, I think, Ken.
Yeah. Am I making a difference? Am I stuck in a rut? And how many times might you hear that? Every day just seems to blend into the same. It's like I'm stuck in a rut. And that's stagnation. There it is. There is kind of a definition for stagnation. And it's that middle adulthood, when the person is out there, as you said it, Rory, middle ages, 40 to around 65 years old. How are they interacting with the world? What is their experience of that? Do they feel that they're making a difference? Or the negative side of that, I get up every morning, I get in my car, I drive to a work where I hate what I do, but I've got to do it because I've just got to pay the bills. No difference has been made there. There's nothing been generated. It's kind of, there's not a purpose or a burning passion for what the person is doing. And that, again, leads to that stagnation. And it affects how we act and interact with those around us, our children, our partner, our work colleagues, our friends, the conversations that we have. So I think a really, really important stage, and a stage that we're in for a long time. It's a 25 year plus stage, that, and maybe many of you listening to this can kind of have a think about where you might be in that stage. And then, of course, we go into the final stage, the 8th of the stages, which is maturity. And here we're looking at ego, integrity versus despair. And the theory kind of suggests that when we get to those older ages, those more golden ages, that when we look forward, there's less ahead of us than there is behind us. The richness of our lives. And I don't mean that there's no richness past the age of 65, at least I hope not, because I'm fast approaching there, Rory. And I intend for there to be lots of richness. But you're not at the midpoint anymore when you get to 65, at least with the life expectancies of today. It is often that much of your life is behind you. Your schooling is behind you. Your career is behind you. The bringing up and integrating your children into the world is behind you. And it is about looking and reflecting back on a life lived. And when you're looking back, do you look back with eyes of regret? Oh, I wish I'd done more of that. I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I'd had the courage to say this to that person. Or do you look back and go, yes, there it is. A difference was made. I'm okay with that. I feel that I acted in my life with integrity. And I like this one. I think this one really resonates with me because I'm aware of this model. One of the things that I kind of use in my own life, in my personal development, Rory, when I'm in situations, is I realize I'm either creating a regret or I am creating a memory. So in every given moment, when we're faced with a decision to make, when we're slightly agitated with our partner, and we are on the cusp of having that strong word with them, how will we feel looking back on that? Will we look back on that and go, yes, that's a good memory? Or will we look back on that and go, ooh, I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I'd have handled that differently. We are making memories or we are making regrets all the time. And I think that really keys in to that 8th stage of Erik Erikson's developmental theory.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Ken. And for those of you who might want to see that in terms of a film, there was a film out a few years ago called Saving Private Ryan. It was about a group of soldiers who went to save a soldier during the Second World War, and it starts off with an old man and his wife and his children and their children, his grandchildren, visiting the war graves in France. And right at the end, he finds the grave of the man who saved him. And he says to his wife, the old man says to his wife in a very poignant moment, have I been a good man? Have I lived a good life? And his wife looks astounded and says, of course you have. And it's at that moment, I think, that this stage is really, really summed up. This taking stock as we come to the kind of autumn in our life, the more yesterdays of tomorrow. Have we made has our contribution to the world been more positive than not? And I think it links very, very strongly in, Ken, to what you were saying about creating memories or creating regrets. In the therapy room, certainly when we're working with older clients, we may see this presentation come up where people look back on their life and start to maybe ruminate on the things that they would have done differently, failed relationships with children, maybe missed career opportunities. And I think this comes up a lot. And I think that sometimes we just got to allow clients to engage with that process, painfully as it is. It's a real existential process, Ken.
It is. This is an interesting theory. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. There's a lot to it. We've covered it in pretty much in depth here today, having a bit of a chat about it. As we always say, we're not the experts on this. We kind of just have the discussions. Have a discussion yourself. And we do have a handout for this. If you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to top of the page, click on podcasts, go to episode 190, that's 190, it's today's episode, and there is a handout that will just give you a brief overview of the 8 stages so that you can have that as a handout. And I think with that, we will take a stage 8 and look back and say, will we look upon this part of the podcast, Rory, with integrity, going, yeah, that was a good section, or will we look back on it with regret and despair and go, oh, I wish we hadn't spoken so long about Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Let's move away from student check-in. We're going in to the digital counselling revolution, where we're going to be speaking about establishing the identity of the client.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Working online gives us a few quandaries and a few things to consider that working face-to-face in the room doesn't. When we work face-to-face in the room, we pretty much know who we're working with. I'm sure there has been times where clients have turned up and, for reasons better known to themselves, they are not who they say they are. I haven't encountered that, and certainly I've never known a therapist who's ever met somebody, to their knowledge anyway, who says this is who I am, gives a name and address, but it's not actually them. I'm sure it must have happened. But online, it does give us an interesting quandary, certainly with telephone work, because someone might phone us up, we can't see them, and they might want counselling. And one of the things that's worth considering is checking the client's identity. And the reason for this is, of course, if someone phones up and asks for help and is a child but presents as an adult, that can give us kind of some ethical difficulties, because we need to know how old the child was. And also there's a whole host of other ethical and kind of moral responsibilities that go with working with a child, such as, what areas of confidentiality are you looking at? You might need to modify your contract if you're working with a child. Are they in any danger because they're under, they could be in some form of danger, which an adult may be able to handle, but a child wouldn't. And it is recommended that you do check someone's identity. And it's caused quite a debate within the online counselling community of how do you do that. I was reading on a forum and some Facebook pages recently that some people say I never check the client's identity, and on the other hand, people were saying, well, they want some form of identity, be it a passport or something that says that the client is who they are. But I do think it's this kind of conundrum is very much an online world conundrum. It's not something we'd ever really consider, I don't think, if we were working face to face, Ken.
Yeah, when I was a boy, Rory, a catfish was a fish with like little feelers and whiskers at the front of its mouth. And that's what a catfish was. Today, a catfish is that, but it is also somebody online who puts themselves forward as somebody else. It is a common term on online, and if you go onto Google and say what is a catfish, you'll see a lot of information about that, including the fish with the little whiskers. But have a look. It is somebody who puts themselves over as somebody else online. It's very, very easy to do. So if you have no video or visual contact with somebody that you might be working with online, they could be anybody. That is the truth of it. They could be anyone. And I think this is really interesting, establishing the identity of a client. It's very easy for somebody to put themselves over as somebody else, and it can be dangerous as well. So to give you an example of where the dangers of this might come in, let's take a hypothetical situation. You engage with a client. The client says, I want to engage in email counselling with you because that is my preferred method. You're proficient in working via email, so you agree to that, and you are now in an email correspondence with this person. Now, I'm going to take a hypothetical presentation that this person is bringing. This person maybe feels that they're in a controlling relationship where their partner is excessively jealous about them in terms of what they do, who they see, always thinks they're up to something. And you are exchanging emails with this person. The danger is if the partner, I'm putting inverted commas here and saying jealous partner, I'm going from the frame of reference, of course, of this client you're working with. If they get into the inbox, they can take part in that email conversation with you, pretending to be their partner, the client, your client, and you would not be aware of it. And you would reply as if it is your client. Now, I'm not saying that happens often, but this is what we're talking about, establishing the identity of that person. Are they the right age? Are they the person they say they are? Are you actually speaking to the same person you started speaking to at the beginning of the relationship? On the phone, you're going to hear a difference in voice. But if you're working via text or email, it's an interesting question to ask. And I think not anything we've ever considered thinking about in face-to-face, in-the-room counselling.
You're absolutely right, Ken. And I note that you picked up on changes of language or syntax in text and email counselling. And you're absolutely right. Somebody's inbox or email address could be compromised, and someone could hijack it and take the counselling session, take it up, and basically like a cuckoo in a nest, really.
Yep.
Hijack and pretend to be someone else. I also think that sometimes when we're working online with clients, and certainly on the phone, listening to the syntax, listening to the use of language, does their use of language and the way they present themselves match up to the details they've given you? So, if you have a contract with someone, and you're working with them, and they tell you, maybe what age they are, and you take this into your notes, and then all of a sudden they start talking in language that you would expect, say, a teenager to speak in. That is a really good time to say, I wonder if the person I'm speaking to is actually the age that they purport to be. And I had an instance of this a good few years ago with a text. I got a text from somebody purporting to be an adult, and quite clearly that person was a child. They were a child because of the way they wrote down and the kind of terms they used. They weren't adult terms. I can seem to remember they used the word sick a lot, in terms of sick being a term that young people use for being great, apparently. So it was quite clear that the text I was receiving was not from an adult, but were from a child. And without going too deeply into that, I had to make some inquiries and find out what that was about. It wasn't counselling related, but it does give us the onus, I think, as practitioners, to at least do the due diligence of trying to be cognizant of, is the person we're working with who they say they are. Now, I'm sure in the world of telephone counselling, it's a lot easier to be anonymous. And of course, the disinhibition effect, which we talked about on this podcast before, can make people play games. So I think if you're an online therapist, building a bit of curiosity into your practice, and just thinking about as a checklist item, just trying to ascertain or make yourself comfortable the person that you're working with is the person they say they are and the age they are, I think is really important.
It's a different world now, and I guess this is why we're called on when we use counselling or psychotherapy through a digital medium to engage in CPD and to engage in critical thinking regarding our practice and how we act and interact within that practice. And you don't need to look very far, Rory, to see a story about someone who used a dating app, met someone on the dating app, thought, oh, they look great, they sound great from their bio and what they're saying, who they are and how they present, and then meet them in person and have a very different experience to who that person would be when they meet them in person. And of course, very often when we're working online, we don't have the luxury of meeting the person in person if you're working through email or text. So have a think about how do you check that out? How do you do it? And I don't have the answer, but I definitely know that the question exists. And again, if you think, well, this is probably unlikely to happen to me, well, my question to you is, when last did you get an email or a text proposing to be from your bank or from one of the services you use or something that you interact with that was a phishing email, that was not, or a phishing text that was not? It was a rogue person impersonating, trying to get information from you. And we need to understand that this technology exists online. There is something online at the moment called deep fake, and deep fake is where you can manipulate a video and get a person to say anything. And if you go on Google again and do a little bit of CPD, put in deep fake, you're going to see things like the ex-President Obama saying completely ridiculous things, and it's really him, and his lips are moving and they are syncing to what is being said, but it is a computer algorithm that manipulates the video for it to look a certain way. We need to know that this kind of technology exists. We need to know that although unlikely, it is possible for somebody to misrepresent themselves when coming into to counselling. Have that in our mind, be aware of it, and think about how you might mitigate that risk within your practice.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And one final thought is, of course, it could go the other way. You might have someone who phones up saying they're a child, but they're actually an adult. And, I've spoken to colleagues at the Samaritan and Childline, and this happens a lot, where somebody will phone up, pretend they're a child for reasons only they will know. But it may be that, if you're not prepared for that and you're not thinking about, I wonder, being curious, I'm not saying skeptical, but being curious and alert to the fact that it's very possible you could get someone contacting you who are not who they say they are, it could be quite frightening. It could be quite off-putting. It could be in a situation where you're unsure what to do. So be very thoughtful, and I think where possible, just be vigilant. I think you can usually tell, certainly by voice, what age somebody is, and you can make an assessment. And of course, as always, if you feel that you're not talking to the person who you're contracted with, make notes about it, speak to supervision, get some insight of what the next steps are.
Well, there you have it. Lots to consider when working online via digital medium. If you're interested, we run a course at Counselling Tutor. It is a certificate in online and telephone counselling. We do cover text and email counselling within that course. And if you're interested in getting more information, go to counsellingtutor.com. Counsellingtutor.com is our mother site, and it's where you get any information of anything that we speak about in our podcasts. So we're now moving on to practice matters, where today, Rory, you took a peek into the practice of Erik Erikson, speaking about the difference between counselling in the UK and the USA.
Indeed, and before we go into that interview, this is a question that gets asked so often in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go into Facebook, type Counselling Tutor in. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in. And you'll see this question come up. How is counselling different in America? So I caught up with Erik Erikson, who now lives in the UK, but trained in America. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Erik Erikson, who has very kindly offered to join us and talk about her experience of working as a counsellor, psychotherapist in America. And there's an interesting fact, isn't there, about where you used to live. Where did you used to live in America?
Well, I lived for many years in I guess we'd call it a village, but it's actually, a town called Glen Ellen in Illinois.
Yes, which is famous. He's got a very famous resident, apart from yourself, Mer, which of course was Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers moved to Glen Ellen when he was 12. So what an interesting insight, a bit synchronous. So how long did you practice in America for?
I practiced in America for, I would say, about 15 years.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you want me to go through the whole process.
Yes.
Yeah. I moved out there in the late 90s. I'm originally from Glasgow, from just outside of Glasgow, Scotland. And I moved out there in the late 90s, and I started university there, went through all of my education and training and licensure there. And then I guess you could say I was licensed. It's a very different system over there, Rory. But I was licensed officially as a therapist in 2007. Mm-hmm. 2007. So. Yeah.
So is it a regulated environment in each state? Does each state have a different law?
Yes, it does. It's heavily regulated and monitored as well. Funnily enough, I was talking to someone about this today who was talking about wanting to move over there and practice there. It's not quite as easy as that. And I should stress to all the listeners, certainly how it was when I was there was you couldn't practice in the counselling field unless you had a master's or above.
Gosh.
Yeah. So, for myself, I got a master's in science and counselling psychology. And then I had to, for a further 2 years, I had to be under supervision and obtain, I think the whole thing, for my master's, I had to obtain about 2,000 hours in order to achieve my master's, 2,000 hours face-to-face placement. So that was throughout the whole of the 2 years I was doing my master's. And then you have to be clinically supervised for a further 2 years to sit for licensure, for an exam, to become what they call a licensed clinical professional counsellor. So an PC. Yeah, it's heavy duty. It's very regulated.
It sounds like it. And in America, do you have like an ethical body? In the UK, we'd have like the BACP or the NCS or UKCP. Is it the same in America?
Yeah, for me, it was the Illinois Counselling Association. Also, you could be a member of the American Psychological Association. And then you could be what's called a nationally certified counselor, which I am too, an NCC, which is more national across the United States. It's noticed, but is for what each person would do, depending on the state that you lived and practiced in. For me, Chicago, Illinois. So then I would go through the licensing board there, which was the Illinois Counselling Association, ICA.
Yes, and if you move state, you'd have to get yourself relicensed. I'm presuming you have to go through their board.
And it's really, really interesting because, for example, I had a friend who practiced in California and then moved back to Chicago, and he didn't have to do anything further. He just had to go and sign up for an Illinois Counselling Association and go through that and get himself licensed in that sense. But if I had moved to California, I would have to take further classes and also further kind of face-to-face placement hours in order to be able to sit the California license. It's really interesting, and it's separate every state that you go to.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of therapists over there find it difficult to do out-of-state online and telephone counselling for that reason, because they can't work out of state without the correct licensing.
Yep, exactly. And like I said, it's very heavily regulated. And then also to maintain your license, you have to continue with CPD, so continual education units. I can think they call them CEUs over there, continuing education units, yes. Obviously, and you have to maintain those for the 2 years that your license. It goes in Illinois, it's a block of 2 years. You get your license gets renewed, I guess you could say, and then in that time you have to get a certain amount of CEUs.
Yeah, and those are accredited, aren't they? Am I right in thinking there's only certain places you can go to get your CPD?
Yeah, there is. And you have to check that. So, you can't just go online and go, oh, there's a course for 4 hours and it looks really interesting. It has to be accredited by our licensing board in order to say, well, these CEUs came from a certain place, and if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in the modality of therapy because in the UK we've got a rich history of teaching person-centered therapy, the work of Carl Rogers, as a single model. And a lot of people, including myself, would have graduated as a qualified practitioner with just that single modality. Mm-hmm. What is the situation like in terms of learning and applying theory in the States?
You can do that if you want to, for likes of myself, what I chose to do was, because I felt this would make me more marketable. So this is what I was advised to do when I started out in the field, was to not just train in one modality. Mm. So when I chose to I did undergrad. My undergrad was a bachelor's, right? My bachelor's in psychology or counselling. But then when I chose my master's degree, I chose a general master's degree, meaning it wasn't CBT for 2 years. It wasn't person-centered for 2 years. It wasn't psychoanalytic. What it was, which is why I chose it, is that it was all of the modalities. Okay. And so you were trained in every area how to utilize those modalities with your patients, which I think that served me really, really well. So, and then what I did is if I particularly really liked something, then I would go a step further and try to get myself licensed in that area, which you can do in the States. For example, I got myself licensed as a CBT therapist. And then I actually went and did the work to become a licensed addictions specialist as well, which I am as well. So, and then I'm also a licensed DBT therapist. I did training with Marsha Linehan many years ago in Chicago, and I'm so fortunate to be able to have done that.
Gosh, that's dialogical behavioural therapy. That's a preferred approach for people with personality disorders, I believe.
Personality disorders. It was originally started for people with borderline personality disorder and highly suicidal patients. And now it's utilized all over the world for everything. It can work. It works really well for people with addiction issues too. But and I'm a big proponent for it. It's amazing. But of course, she stole a lot of the stuff from CBT because it's a mixture of DBT and CBT that's in it. But yeah, no, I love it. And so what I did was I wanted to make sure that I was very marketable. And I think I didn't know that at that young age. I think probably a professor or someone probably said to me, this is what you should do. And I just took their advice, and I'm really glad that I did. And now when I teach myself, I advise that to my students, that to consider not just getting yourself specialized in one modality unless that's your be all and end all and what you want to do.
Absolutely. I think that's an interesting observation in terms of being marketable. Over in America, of course, it's a privatized healthcare system. And I guess that therapy could be accessed via private insurance. Would that be the case? Do the insurance companies have any stipulation on how you work, given that the insurance companies ultimately paying for the therapy?
Yeah, they have stipulations that anyone who is you can. So the stipulations will be that you have to be a certain level of education, a certain level of licensure to be able to be covered by the insurance company. So I practiced for about 10 years privately. I had my own practice with two people that I went to graduate school with and did my master's with. We went on to do a private practice on the side, basically. And all of us were master's educated and licensed. And that's what the insurance company looked for. So why I talked about the private practice is because when I started my private practice, I then had to sign up with all of the private insurance companies for mental health so that my patients were able to access their mental health part of their policy and that everybody would get paid. So, and things covered. But there's stipulations to that, Rory. You have to, like I said, you have to be master's level or above. You can't have just a bachelor's. And then on top of that, you also have to be licensed, so it's a process. It's a really long process. And I should add, when I came out of my master's, you take the first exam, which for me was a licensed professional counsellor. So I became an LP. Then I waited another 2 years and I took the second licensure exam, which is when they add the LCPC, the Licensed Clinical Professional Counsellor.
Gosh.
So that's how you get all those letters behind your name.
I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people listening who are kind of listening to this open mouth. That journey is such a long, it's a huge journey, isn't it? And you should be congratulated for it because that's a huge canon of work that you've accomplished. You're back in the UK now. Did you see any advantages or any benefits of the way the UK system works, maybe over the American system?
I might be controversial here, Rory. In terms of accreditation, etc., I'm a big proponent of it. I know a lot of people are not. I've saw a lot of different comments, but I think the listeners will also understand why I'm probably a bigger proponent of it, because I worked really hard to get to where I am. I jumped tons of hurdles to get myself licensed, and then I came home. And I've also went back I'm just about to finish another master's degree to get myself accredited with a British body here in the UK. So, which they've agreed to do, which is great, because not all of my experience, it wasn't because of all of my experience. It's a long story, so I won't get into it. But anyway, I'm going through an accreditation process at the moment. So I think what it does is, I think a lot of people may think they can be a therapist, but I actually think it's a skill, and it takes time to learn that skill. It takes education to learn that skill. I think it takes a certain amount of experience. And I think it's really important for it to be monitored, to be regulated. But that's my opinion.
Yes. So thank you so much for sharing your journey, the arc of your journey, that connection with Glen Allen, which of course, will always sparkle the eyes of anybody who's person-centered. So Mir Elkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Really interesting. Thank you to Mir Elkin. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview.
A lot of food for thought there. So what a podcast. We covered in great detail the work of Erik Erikson and lifespan development. And I'm grateful for Ken for his articulation and his expertise on this. As he said, he undertook some training on this. We moved into establishing the identity of the clients in the digital counselling revolution to try and identify who the client is, to make sure that who you're speaking to is who they say they are. And finally, we caught up with Mir Elkin, who talked about her experiences as a American therapist training in an American environment. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and hey, join the digital counselling revolution.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.